Hi there. Today I really want to dig into this topic of birth control, our brain, and trauma, and how the combination of those could be a toxic combination for some of us. So I really hope that you're on board for a little bit meatier of a video today, and we can dig into some of these details that I've learned about trauma, about hormonal birth control, and about our hormones in general. So I really hope that this will be interesting to you and it might be helpful in your health journey. Okay, so let's get down into it. Let's start with birth control. Birth control, in some studies that we are doing in the scientific community, we have been seeing that it dysregulates the stress response. So it means that we can be hypersensitive to stress. Now, a little bit later in this video, I'll tell you how it makes us more sensitive to stress, but let's talk about some of the effects of that. So let's start with anxiety. Women who take a hormonal contraceptive can suffer from higher levels of anxiety and depression. Anxiety specifically is often associated with the GABA receptor in our neurological system, in our nervous system, and that receptor is an inhibitory receptor. So it's going to inhibit certain signals and calm them down. But progestin, which is an artificial form of progesterone used in birth control, that can kind of prevent the proper metabolism of some of the receptor neurotransmitters for the GABA receptor. So what that means is that the metabolism of those kind of signals that are going to the GABA receptor, they might not be in the proper ratios. So what can happen is if they're affected, that either means that GABA is being overstimulated or understimulated. And in the case of anxiety being the presenting issue, it most likely is overstimulated, meaning we are not having enough GABA stimulation to inhibit anxiety in our system. And so some of these things are results of taking an artificial progesterone. So what are some of these consequences of having higher anxiety levels? Well, if you already experience PMS, it could make that worse. It could even push someone into having PMDD, which is, it can look like a cyclical version of bipolar syndrome. And so some of these are mood disorders that are pretty serious and could affect someone's mental health and their physical health and their relationships. So I think that this is something that women should be aware of when they're considering, is hormonal birth control right for me, and what type might be right for them as well. So if someone is at risk of high anxiety levels, then having a progesterone form that is going to have synthetic progesterone could affect this and could make that type of symptom for them worse. Okay, and so the next thing that I had mentioned was depression, that birth control can make women more apt to be depressed. And some of the reasons we're going to get into a little later in the video. But when women have depression, this can be studied, and we do see higher levels of this. As I've mentioned in one of my other videos, we can have higher rates of suicide for women on oral contraceptive. And that, I think, is a pretty serious situation. So we should be, as women, aware of this before we put this into our body. And one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting that really hasn't been studied is the connection between birth control and anger or empathy. We have studies that show that birth control can change our partner selection and the oxytocin levels, which is a bonding hormone, towards our partner. But what has got me thinking in doing the research for this video is, how could that affect someone's bonding with their child? Mother and child bonding is also through oxytocin levels. And so if someone is taking birth control during their early child's development, that could affect their own oxytocin and how they respond to their child. Not only that, but their partner. And so it's really interesting to consider how some of this could be interacting with our brain. And we're going to get to how it can be interacting with people who've also experienced trauma in a little bit. Okay, so before we move forward, I really want to teach you guys about this kind of intersecting piece, and this is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland helps regulate our sex hormones. It also helps regulate our stress hormones. And so this is kind of the intersection between these two systems, the reproductive system and our stress system and management of stress. And so the pituitary gland does become dysregulated from sex hormones when we're on hormonal contraceptives. That's the whole point. So that we don't have FSH and LH signaling for our egg to be developed and then ovulated, and then we become pregnant. So when you're putting a stop to the production of those hormones, as well as other things like estrogen and progesterone, because we're providing synthetic versions so our body doesn't actually have to produce those, then we're changing how this axis of not only our sexual health, but our stress response. And so what I want to mention here is that people who've experienced a traumatic event in their life, they also are going to have most likely a disrupted stress response. So if you're combining these two situations where you have already the adaptability of having a dysregulated stress response, and now you're going to add in a medication that is intended to dysregulate hormones that are connected with our stress response, this can get to be a really sticky situation. But one of these things is our pituitary gland, which is at the intersection of this experience. So we're going to start to transition and talk about the trauma piece as well, and bring in some of these tidbits about hormonal birth control and how that can play a factor in those who've been traumatic, who have had traumatic experiences. So to start, when we're a human who's gone through a traumatic experience, we are a human. Humans are meant to survive and thrive in social settings and social groups. So our body, our mind, and our behaviors modify in order for us to be able to survive within the group of humans that we are in. So if you consider that, if someone's been in a traumatic experience, whether that be at war, whether that be in their family, whether that be at school, all of those mean that your body has adapted, and for some reason our bodies are made in a way that even just one experience can cause a reorganization of how our body is relating to stress. And so that one traumatic event can cause dysregulation of our stress response. So because of that experience, reorganizing that part of our hormonal system can affect how we respond to stress in the future. And so while this might sound a little doom and gloom and a little of a bummer, the good news is if we adapted to an unhealthy situation, we also have the capacity to adapt to a healthy situation and encourage adaptability in the opposite direction. So we can also heal. We also have a body that has the capacity to bring about healing on a mental, emotional, and physical level, which I think is amazing. Okay, so when someone is traumatized, we have these parts of our brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, and our amygdala. There are two amygdala. And so what can happen is our amygdala are like a smoke detector and smoke alarm, and our medial prefrontal cortex is the watchtower. Now, I really liked that Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he used these as ways to describe these parts of the body. And so the watchtower is what gives us an overview or perspective of what's happening. The smoke detector, the amygdala, just respond. They tell us that there's stress, period. It doesn't matter if you're frying an egg and you maybe get a little bit crispy edges and there's a tiny bit of smoke, they're going to say, oop, there's smoke. Or if your house is on fire. If your house is on fire, you want that smoke detector to go off and keep going off so you wake up and you get out. Now, what can happen is those two parts of our brain have to be interconnected. Some way they have to be able to send a signal to each other for regulation to be proper and for us to calm down a response that's about an egg that we understand is not on fire, and also for us to make sure that we pay attention when there is an actual emergency like our house being on fire. Obviously, these are hypothetical situations, but in our body, we can have a situation where maybe we get a little too close to the edge of the road in someone's car that we're not driving, and so we overreact. I know that I can do that. That would be a overreaction like the egg being fried. But there are situations where maybe we walk down a alley that isn't safe for us to be walking down and someone starts following us. That could be a situation that isn't safe that we do need to have a stress response to and make sure that we can get out of that situation. So, as I mentioned, these two parts of our brain have to have some modulation and communication. Now, what I've found out is really, really interesting. Estradiol is part of what modulates the response between our watchtower and our smoke alarm. So our medial prefrontal cortex and our amygdala, that connection is modulated by estradiol. Guess what happens when we take hormonal birth control? We stop producing natural endogenous, meaning I produced it, estrogen. And so that means that we are going to have a synthetic version of estrogen that is not going to fit in the same types of receptors the same way as estradiol. So we're losing our capacity to modulate stress by taking certain types of birth control, ones that include things like synthetic estrogens. So keeping this in mind, our body is going to plummet its own production of estradiol and other estrogens in order to make the balance between having this synthetic version of that is detecting as being present. And so this is something that I thought was really interesting. So what can happen if we can't turn off that stress response? Could that be a toxic combination? What happens if we have experienced a traumatic event and we don't have that ability to turn that stress response off? What can happen afterwards? And what I thought was really interesting is that it modulates this response and connection. So could we have some overreactions to stress that is actually a lot lower than it actually should be? And what I think is really interesting is that there are potential social implications of this that women are possibly not told and might not be aware of while they're on this type of medication. So I think that this is really interesting for me, for my own personal interest, but I hope it's interesting for you to learn about yourself and possibly you and other people that you might know who might have some of these two kind of parts of hormonal issues and also of wanting to prevent pregnancy and have possibly experienced something traumatic in your life. Okay, so we've talked about estrogen, and not all birth control that's hormonal uses estrogen. Some use progesterone. So how could that be affecting our brain and past trauma? So as I've mentioned in other videos, progesterone is produced in male bodies by the adrenal cortex. So not only do women have this, but it also plays a role in more than just our reproductive health because men also produce this hormone. And so although we might think of it as what helps maintain our endometrial layer for a baby, it also has receptors in our brain, in our amygdala and our cerebellum. And I talked about in another video how it has neuroprotective effects. And so progesterone, if we take a synthetic progesterone, our body is not going to produce natural progesterone, endogenous progesterone. So what studies have shown, I'm going to provide a whole lot of links in the description of this video, but the progesterone not being produced means that we have parts of our brain that can actually atrophy. And we have progesterone receptors that we've been able to show that are on our amygdala and on our cerebellum. So consider this. If our fire alarm, our smoke alarm, has receptors for progesterone and we're taking synthetic progesterone, we're not taking natural progesterone because our body is not producing much of it, it's causing some of these receptors to be atrophied, then consider this: progesterone is the hormone that keeps us calm and happy and kind of grounded. And so if we don't have natural production of that, and there are receptors that are sensitive to that, if we don't have a hormone that's going to cause that, then we can kind of go on that other scale, like I said, towards the anxiety, the depression, the anger, the lack of empathy end of the spectrum emotionally, because we have receptors that are not being used by a hormone. And so they're going to begin to atrophy. We might even lose some receptors. Certain receptors are adaptive and others are not. And so when we have a lack of certain hormones, we reduce the number of receptors we have on the edge of a cell. And so that could be part of what's happening. And when we have, like I said, a traumatic experience, we have this dysregulation between our amygdala, our medial prefrontal cortex, and our cerebellum is part of what helps us emotionally regulate ourselves. And so if we don't have some of this capacity already, we're already at a disadvantage, having had a traumatic experience in our life. And then you add in a hormonal based medication that could disrupt that cycle further. What could happen? I think that it's really interesting. I really wish that there was more research done on this. There isn't a whole lot of research done in this area. I didn't find any studies that connected hormonal birth control and traumatic experiences like ACEs, adverse childhood events. And so I think that this would be a great area for people to be able to research and better understand, so that we can better advise women and support women in their choice about any type of hormonal birth control or any type of birth control when they get to the point where they need to choose that for themselves. And so I think that this would be a great area for us to be able to better empower women and to help them be able to take control of their life, not only their physical health, but their mental health, their career could be affected by some of these things. So I really think that this would be a great area for other women, myself, you possibly, to be able to look into in more detail. I really hope that this video was helpful and you gained something. So if you did, I'd love if you gave the little like button a nudge so that this video can get out to more women and we can be able to empower others just like you. And so I hope that this was helpful. And until next time, be well.